Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to Heartline Ministry. Did you know that God's delay does not necessarily mean a permanent no? We're going to talk about that in a few moments.
Celebrating Christ our King, lifting up his holy banner, marching into the promised land. Chains of sin have now been broken. There is glory in this place, where the Joshua generation walking in his amazing grace, walking in his amazing grace.
Well, once again, greetings, everyone. You are tuning in to Heartline Ministry. I'm Pastor Harold Noyes, pastor of the Community Christian Church located in Athens, Vermont. Next to me is my co-host, Pastor Timothy Golden. He's pastor of Life on Main in Charlestown, New Hampshire. And we have started a study, Tim, on the book of Esther. And last week we discovered that the king now had a year-long feast, partying time. They really knew how to party back then, I guess. And he brought in a lot of kings, a lot of princes, a lot of royalty, both men and women. And he was trying to establish with them support for him to go and to invade, Rome, right? Mm-hmm. So he wanted to get their support, wanted to get their okay for doing that, and best way to do that is show them how much money he had, how much wealth he had, how much, glitter and everything else, mm-hmm. and we do that. So in reading, I'm finding that from chapter 1 through chapter 2, at least from what I've read, is that there's about a 4-year span. Because now he's gone on his campaign,
yep,
and he lost badly. Mm-hmm. All right, so he was really humiliated. And that's where we now pick up the account in chapter 2. Mm-hmm. As you noted when we were talking about this, the king probably was not in a very good mood. And I think you noted that probably he had some anger issues.
Yep.
We know that to be true just by the way in which he treated Vashti, for example, mm-hmm. For saying no when he wanted her to come and present herself before all royalty.
Yep.
And I think he acted in haste. Mm-hmm. Though some would certainly qualify him, saying, well, he had every right to. She had no right to deny him. She had no right to not to do it. But, of course, we also noted that she was caring for all the other queens and princesses and mm-hmm. women, and she was taking care of them. So she may have been mm-hmm. overworked and overtired besides, and we know how things go when we get that way. So yeah. I don't know. It's a question for me.
It is. And then as you had mentioned, that now we've had 4 years that have pretty much come and gone. And it's only in the very beginning of this chapter that says that when the wrath of the king had subsided.
Right.
In regard specifically to Vashti.
Yep.
So it took 4 years. Talk about holding a grudge.
Right.
And so there's definitely some major issues there.
Now, do you think that, you were talking about, especially in regards to Vashti, is it that, or is it also the fact that he got humiliated in the battle?
I'm sure it's a combination of all the above. I don't think that being defeated helped matters any.
Right.
That's obviously going to add to the frustration. You think you're doing everything right. You think you're going to come out victorious. You think you've done everything necessary to make that happen, only to have it fall flat on its face. And now
right.
you've got to go back to your kingdom and face the music.
Yeah. And, and I also wonder, and this is just me wondering out loud, I also wonder if maybe some of the wrath would also be maybe he didn't quite get the support, or at least the support was not as strong as he thought it would be, and that's why he got humiliated in this war in which he was in.
Or as we've already seen with a lot of other wars, maybe started off getting the support that he needed, but when things weren't going quite as quickly as others wanted, there may have been a backing out. But whichever, it definitely didn't go according to his plan.
Yeah, I guess probably the safest bet would be this. We just know that he was angry, and he was very mad, and the combination of all that has now happened over a 4-year period means that the people are now going to want to, those around him, his higher echelon, those around him are going to want to appease him. They're going to want to tread lightly, and come up with something that would make him forget it all.
But yet also at the same token, they have probably also felt let down by their king.
Yep.
And as we're going to find out later as this book continues on, and some of the things that kind of rose up in the midst regarding conflicts against the king, you can be sure that there are probably some that were trying to tell him, look, we think we need to go this way, and maybe the king decided, no, I'm going to go this way, and that can cause some dissension in the ranks as well. And so all these things, it's a very emotional, chaotic mess is what it is.
Yeah. And I've even read, I think it was Matthew Henry, for example, goes and says that some of the higher echelon were even afraid that the king was going to invite Vashti back. Because we know that he loved her. And we know that he kind of exiled her, into her own little palace and things of that nature. So he didn't kill her. He did not, eliminate her by any means.
Though he would have had every right to do that.
Yeah, he would have, but he didn't. So that there was a strong attachment there between the king and Vashti. And I think some of the people were afraid that he's going to invite her back to be queen, and they did not want that because they were certainly afraid if she gets back in, that's going to be my head, and my wife's going to hear about it, and she's going to rebel like Vashti did, and then we're going to be in trouble. And so this is where the plot starts to thicken, as I look at it, from the time of great partying and festivals and all this other stuff. Now you have, the loss of a battle, of a conflict. The king is now back on the throne, and what's going to happen? And to me, this is where we pick up the whole account.
Yeah.
So why don't I open in prayer, and then we're going to go through chapter 2, and there's 23 verses to it. Some of the verses are repetitious, so we may not do 20, verse by verse, but as far as to be able to go through the account, chapter 2, and see what God has in store for us. So I'm going to open in prayer, and then I'm going to have Tim read chapter 2. Father, we thank you so very much, Lord, just for the fact that you rule and that you overrule, and that you have a plan. And sometimes your delays does not mean a permanent no. You just said, wait a while. And Father, we're going to see that in several instances in this book. So, Father, open up our hearts, open up our minds to see what you have for us today and how we can apply this to our very walk of life today in Christ Jesus. So, Lord, bless our time, use it for your glory, and we thank you in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. So let's read the word together. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, then that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai passed in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go in to the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
Wow. So a lot is happening now here in chapter 2. And once again, we'd said that, the king had just gotten off a bad war. Mm-hmm. He'd come back, and his people apparently had decided, okay, we got to do something to satisfy the king. So we're going to have another, I wouldn't call it a party, I guess, like the feasting in chapter 1. But it was a year-long search now for the queen. And all the governors and kings and everybody rounded up all the young virgins and brought them to the castle, or had them come to the castle or to the palace. I look at that and say, wow, that's crazy. But that was the thing in the culture of that day, I guess, and that is what happened. So, I look at this and say, wow, I can't fathom it. But.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot more that was going on. As we know, not just from our generation, but as you look back throughout the generations, and I'm sure was the case here, politics is politics.
Yep.
And she's coming to represent. She doesn't carry the same level of authority as the king has, obviously, especially in that day when women were not considered on equal plane. But still, she was queen. And so there were certain requirements in the way she conducted herself, much as there are with kings and queens or even presidents and first ladies in our country. There's certain ways they're expected to conduct themselves. And so you're talking about bringing somebody that is not and has not been part of the royal family, somebody that's a commoner, because it's from these people are coming from all over the country. And they're being brought into this palace. They have no idea of how to act like royalty. And so in addition to learning to smell like royalty, you had to learn to really permeate royalty even in your persona, in the way you conducted yourself, in the customs, in mannerisms, in tone, all of that stuff, the way you conducted yourself in the presence of the king.
Right.
All those things had to come into play. So it was going to take quite a while to teach and train these women in these manners.
And one of the things that I thought was very interesting in my studies of this is that so many of the commentators were saying this is not just a beauty contest.
Right.
A beauty contest would simply go like we have, the contest for Miss America and all the others, Miss USA and all, that, they go and they have maybe 4 or 5 things that they have to do, the evening gowns and the swimsuits and all this other stuff. And, they're judged on that. But as you have pointed out, this is going to be a teaching, a changing, even of her very character, as to how she responds to others in royalty, how she responds to the king and in front of the king. And I have to give the king credit, and this goes back to chapter 1, because even when he was feasting, he not only did it for royalty. It says he did it for everybody.
Yeah.
So he even gave gifts to his people, to his subjects.
Yeah.
So he was a very generous king. There's no doubt about that. And it talks about the generosity of the king here. And, that's one thing we can say about him is that he was a very, very generous king to everybody, not just to those of royalty or those of another estate. So we go on here, and Tim, as we read these things, when the wrath of the king was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what the decree against her. So I don't know. I have trouble with that verse, because I like to think that, maybe he was reconsidering. Maybe he was saying, I don't think I treated her very well. Because he goes and he talks about, and what was decreed against her. So I'm wondering if he's having second thoughts. And once again, maybe not, maybe he is. We don't know. It doesn't really tell us. But, if he has the generosity that chapter 1 talks to us about, and the generosity that we're going to find out here in chapter 2, maybe he's having second thoughts.
Well, and I don't think that's far-fetched, because, again, how much time has gone by? It's been 4 years. And it'd be very easy for him to look at this whole situation now and say, well, what's done is done. It's in the past. So be it. But this is starting to permeate his thinking to an extent that it probably hasn't for a number of years. Now, maybe that was because of everything else that was on his mind regarding this conflict that was going to take place, this war. And so now it's the first time he's really had to really think about her. But the thing is he is thinking about her. And a lot of time has gone by, but he's not just thinking about her, he's thinking about what was done to her. And the fact that they're pointing this out tells me in that is some level of thinking, were we right? Were we not right? Did the punishment fit the crime? And this sort of thing. And so whether or not he would have taken her back, we don't know. But like you said, we are really getting a picture, I think, here of the kind of care that he still did have in his heart for her, that 4 years later he would even be giving this the time of day.
Yeah, and matter of fact, I even think, Tim, if we go back into verse 1, just simply with the 3 words, he remembered Vashti. To me, that means it's more than just a fleeting thought.
Yeah.
And we need to see this, because this whole contest in chapter 2 is not just a beauty contest. This is going to be a contest of who pleases the king best. Okay, that's what it's going to be about.
Yeah.
Whether it be in the bedroom, or whether it be how she responds to royalty, whether it be how well she learns how to conduct herself. You know, there's many facets of this.
Yeah.
And he's going back to Vashti and thinking, goodness, you know, she was the perfect queen. You know, she pleased me well. She knew how to treat the others in royalty. She knew how to come before me, you know, so far better than all the other women. You know, so that's what I see in those 3 words. He remembered Vashti.
And it's not even just this is something going on in his own mind. Because again, let's look at context. 4 years.
Yep.
He is now all of a sudden remembering her. He's putting thought into this. Oh, all of a sudden, also, these 4 years later, apparently hasn't been a topic of discussion for 4 years.
Yep.
But all of a sudden, isn't it interesting that at the time that he's remembering, his closest attendants make a recommendation, let virgins be brought. So you know this isn't just remembering here. He's verbalizing this to those that are around him, to those that were his closest attendants. He is somehow processing this to the point that they feel like they need to make some sort of a recommendation here now that they haven't had to make before.
Yeah. You know, and I'm wondering, you know, now it's going to be a year. This whole chapter is talking about another year, 6 months of purification, 6 months of training and all the other stuff, 6 months of the beauty thing. So it's a whole year. And that's why we came up with the statement, you know, God delays does not mean a permanent no. At least not, you know, generally speaking, it doesn't. It means that, okay, not yet. My time is not ready yet. But there will be a time. You know, and it's just like maybe some things that some people, you know, the folks that are watching, some things they've been praying about, but God doesn't seem to have answered yet, and God doesn't seem to have really taken care of that problem or that situation. Don't take it as a permanent no. I think what we need to do is we need to sit back and say, okay, everything happens in His perfect timing. And we're going to see that in this. God's perfect timing. And to me, that is so very important for us as Christians today to remember that, you know, and not get angry with God because He didn't do it when I wanted it. You know, and so much we have that mentality. God, I want it, and I want it now. And, you know, and God's going to stand back and say, no, I'll do it. You know, I can take care of this when I want to take care of this.
And it's not, and I think that, and this is a picture we see here, is it's not like, okay, bring all these women in, and now we're just going to have them sit back, and a year from now, I'll make a decision. This year that they are not in that calling, right? Or that things have not seemed to really progress to any definitive decision. It was still a time of a lot of activity. It was a lot of time of preparation. It was still the things that this eunuch was having them do were things the king was checking in with this eunuch. Periodically. Where are things at? How are things going? And so it's a very active time. The culmination may not have happened of what they were there to do and wouldn't for another year. But everything that was going to happen that year was all leading to that. And so I think sometimes we get this attitude of, I'm at point A, I want to be at point B. But we forget there's a lot of subpoints in between A and B that need to really come to fruition. Sometimes there's things outside of us that God has to orchestrate to prepare for us to be able to be in that realm. But more often than not, there are some things He needs to prep in us. You know, and I think of like even for myself, I got the call from the Lord into the ministry back in 1986 when I was a sophomore in college. But it wouldn't be until 1997, some 11 years later, that I would find myself actually in a pastoral role. But I will tell you, that whole 11 years, there was no idle time.
Yeah.
God, and there were times I thought was idle because it's like, he'd have me at this church and I'd be doing worship leading, or, I'd be at this church and I was, doing, heading the missions department or whatever the case was. And it's like, okay, God, these things are not this is not being a pastor. But in hindsight, it's like, oh, yes, it is.
Yeah, right,
because
right,
all
right.
the things he was teaching me over the course of that time were things that were necessary before he could fully place me in that role. But he wanted to take me through not just 12 months, but 11 years of preparation
Yep.
before he could say, okay, now you're ready. And now let's step into it. But now I look back on those 11 years, even though it seemed like an eternity back then, I look back on those and I thank God so much that he gave me those years
Right.
to learn outside of the actual pastoral role. It was such a mark of his grace.
That's why I think that, it's so interesting for us to understand, and I think all of us need to understand this, those who are watching as well as Tim and I, that God has a process that he follows, so that he does, to prepare us into the roles in which he has called us. Patty and I saw the same thing as you did. My previous churches, both my wife and I can look back at our previous pastorates and say each one was preparing us for Athens, for what we're doing now and how God is working now. And we can see his steps, his stepping stones, if you will, in our life. And we're seeing that same process worked out here, that there's a process in which they had to go. So in verse 2, the king's servants said, okay, we're going to go find beautiful young virgins, and they're all for the king. So the king appointed officers. Now, these are going to be people who know the king very personally. They know his needs, they know his wants, they know all these things about him, and they're going to go all around the provinces to find and to pick out these young women. I find it interesting that, some of my commentaries, and I think it was like Matthew Henry and maybe even J. Vernon McGee, in particular, those two guys, were saying that, I can imagine for that next year that there's a lot of young women, either they went and they got married because they didn't want to go through this process, because they knew, as we're going to come out here, they knew that it was only going to be like, if they went in and they were rejected, it was a one-night stand. That's it. And they would have no more contact with the king. So they're going to go through all of this and this arduous work just for a few moments of glory. And I can imagine a lot of virgins, a lot of fathers, a lot of mothers did not want their young girls to have to go through that process. Oh, it would be nice if they were the one, but they are the one out of how many are going to be brought,
Yeah.
And there could have been hundreds, could have been thousands, I don't know. But would we want our daughters to go through that?
Well, and as we can see from chapter 1, the provinces of his kingdom stretch a large area. And so there were not just going to be a handful of people. Your chances of being picked were very much slim to none.
Right. And once again, so I think that there are certainly some that would go and, say, hey, I know Bobby down the road and he's single and he's kind of gave me the eye. Well, I'll go entice him to marry me, that kind of thing, just so that I would not be chosen, to do this. So I think that you had some of that playing a part, so that the king appoints officers in all the provinces, and like you say, it is a massive landmass that they have to go of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins under Shushan the palace, to the house of women unto the custody of Hege, and the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. So He's going to provide everything. He's going to provide the chamberlains, and he's going to provide the maidens, and he's going to provide everybody to do all this. But it's arduous work, you know. And I look at it and I say, "Wow, you know, this is crazy." But how many women still do that today?
Yeah.
Whether it be, well, I want to, you know, become an actress, so I'm going to do these things, or I'm going to be a politician, whatever the case may be. I'm willing to sacrifice for that one moment of fame. And that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
And it is. It's just a split moment of fame. Because if you're not chosen, guess what? If these women were not chosen, they would go spend the night with the king to please the king, and I think that's more than sexually, to please the king, but then they're put in the concubine pool or something, you know, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, wow, I mean, this would take a lot, in my view, as a parent, to allow my daughter to do that, you know. So, and then we got in verse 4, let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So, once again, you know, he said, yeah, you know, that's reasonable. I think that'd be fun. So let's do that, right? So that would take his mind off Vashti. Because we know that he was thinking of Vashti in verse 1.
Yep.
And now in verse 4, we're finding, okay, I'm looking for a replacement of Vashti, and so now she's going to be out of the picture. All right? So what's going to happen? In Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, and so forth. And you go down through, and I think it's really, really interesting that they really pointed out, here's a Jew. Now, what's he going to tell Esther? Do not
tell them.
reveal who you are. Okay? Why? Why would that be?
Well, number one, she was just a Jew. You know, they were less than.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the thing is, wait a minute, you wouldn't be considered if he knew the culture you're coming out of.
That's right.
Even with your beauty and even with your flair and everything else, you would not be considered. So don't say a word because we are not a respected people.
Right.
All right? So, but it's interesting that now you have the uncle who's coming, and apparently he found favor with the king because we're going to see through this whole chapter that he moves up very quickly in the ranks. You know, and he's very well thought of by seemingly everybody. So he's moving up in the ranks. So he goes and says, okay, who had been carried away, verse 6, from Jerusalem, and that to me I find it very interesting. So if he's carried away from Jerusalem, what do you think he's going to be?
Yep.
But they didn't give that any thought, I guess. All right, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, that had been carried away. So wouldn't this make him a slave? Because he was carried away under captivity, right? And then you have that he was brought up, Hadassah, that's be Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. They had apparently died. All right, maybe they died in the taking of the captives. You know, once again, this is speculation. We don't know what killed them, but I suspect it may have been during that Inquisition or whatever that had happened. So she lost her parents. She was beautiful. She was fair. She was all that anybody would want, apparently, and whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her for his own daughter. So he, you know, basically he adopted her, you know, as we would look at. And he treated her as his own. I find here interesting that probably there was no other children. And it does not say anything about his wife.
Nope.
So maybe he was even a single guy bringing up now this young girl. All right? Once again, we don't know. It does not say. So it comes to pass, verse 8, when the king's commandment and his decrees were heard, and when many maidens were gathered together. Now it says many. It does not tell us. Will it be hundreds of thousands? We have no idea. they go to the palace, to the custody of Hegai, and Esther was brought unto the king's house to the custody keeper of the women. So here she is. She's there. She's beautiful. Nobody makes inquiring at all. What religion are you? What nationality are you? Anything.
Which right there shows God's favor.
Yeah.
That wouldn't even be mentioned because, again, if you're talking about choosing, not only with Esther, but even with Mordecai, as said, stepping up in the ranks,
Right.
You're going to have somebody in those roles. They'd want to know those things.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge oversight to be considered just an oversight.
So even as we know, for example, if we look at a couple of scripture verses or at least mention them, in Corinthians it tells us that Satan blinds the eyes of people. But I'm seeing here that God can also blind the eyes of people.
Yep.
Because though I imagine, I just can't imagine otherwise, I imagine she must have looked the part of the Jewish nationality and things like that, but they didn't see it.
Yep.
Either they didn't want to see it or God, once again, just kind of put a gloss over their eyes so they were not able to see it. Whatever the case, God rules and he overrules.
That's right.
And we're seeing that in this because they don't seem to be cognizant of the fact that she's Jewish or that Mordecai is Jewish.
Which just to show you the level of God's involvement in the whole process.
Yeah.
How tuned in he is to everything that's going on, not just the final moment of her becoming queen, but setting the stage for that to happen.
So now what happens is she goes amongst all these women, right? And the keeper of the women finds favor in Esther. Of all the other beautiful women around, she's the one, according to verse 9, she pleased him. Now the him is who? The keeper of the women, right? And she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her the things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meant to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So she was given priority, right? So once again, you're seeing how God rules and overrules, how God sets this process in where, she's found favor.
Yep.
And I'm sure that when he goes before the king, and I'm sure the king calls him in often, how's the process going? Do you have anybody? And all of this, I'm sure that he's saying to the king, well, I got one that I'm bringing up that I really believe you're going to find favor in, over above all the others. So he's prepping the king, I see, in all of this. So once again, verse 10, we're told she had not showed her people, meaning her nationality, where she came out of. She had not showed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Once again, we are going to find out towards the end of this book why this is so important.
Right.
Because if he'd done it now, she probably would be taken out of the process. But God sees favor in her, and God has a process and says, no, don't show it now, because things are going to culminate where you're going to have to show it. But that's going to come later on in this account, in this wonderful story. Now, I find it interesting, starting with verse 11. To me, this is a whole new thing. In verse 11, Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. You see him now coming up in the ranks, because not everybody would be able to walk close to the women's house and be able to inquire, how's Esther doing? How's she doing? What's happening? What's the process? How far along is she? And, as any parent would do, to check out on the daughter and find out what is happening. Well, so he is already in place of prominence, as I see in verse 11, right?
Yep.
So, verse 12, when every man's turn was come to go to the king, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women. Okay? For so were the days of the purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with seed odors, and with other things for the purification of the women. Now, the purification of women was more than just making them pretty,
Right.
right? It also had to do with their manners. It had to do with the way they carried themselves. It had to do with how they respond and how they react and all of those things, right? How to take care of all that. So, it's been a year. So once again, now there's been 5 years, if you want to add it up together, from the time of Vashti being taken out of the role as queen, and now this happens. If my numbers are right?
Yeah.
Then thus every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired, was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. So whatever the young woman thought that she needed to please the king, she was able to take that with her, whatever that is. And I have no idea what that is all about.
Right.
But she was able to do it. But we're finding in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody. So, like I say, it was just a one-night stand, or it was just a one evening where she got to show the king what she could do, and then if he moves the scepter, no, depart. And that'll be the last time she enters the king's quarters, And I say, wow, all this work for just the few moments of glory. I mean, I look at it and say, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And I just find it really also amazing how we're not given details of anything that takes place. Now, one can imagine, okay, you come into the king's palace in the evening and you go home in the morning.
Yeah.
It implies some things.
Right.
But here's my issue with that. Usually everywhere else in Scripture that you see something of this nature, if there is a laying with, or then, as they would often say, he knew her,
right,
which would mean the same thing. We don't hear any of that here. So did that even take place? We don't know.
Have no idea.
It would appear on the surface of just what you think of regarding the time of day that's probably may have been what happened. But the fact that is not shared with us tells one of two things. Either one, it didn't happen, or two, which is equally as important, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, it's not that
to what's taking place. And so the Lord did not want us to get hung up there and lose sight of what was really taking place.
Now, verse 15, the whole picture changes because Esther now, it's her turn, okay? Yeah. And it goes and says who she was the daughter of, and so forth. And then Mordecai, who'd taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king. She required nothing. I find that interesting. Yeah. She didn't take in anything that would help her. Why? She didn't need any help. And I find it interesting. Even though God is not mentioned in this book per se, is it implied? Is he implied? I think so. And I have to, this is just me, but I have to think that she was going to rely upon him. Being a Jewess and so forth. I'm going to rely upon my God. If it's what he wants, great. If it isn't, fine. I'm going to go as I am. What you see is what you get. That kind of thing. Yeah. And that's how I see that in verse 15, because she required nothing but that Haggai, the son of the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Now, upon the sight of all that, that's everybody up to this point, right? However, if they all found favor in her, it's probably more likely that the king will too, because he depended upon their opinions. I would think.
Well, we see that throughout chapter 1 and even thus far into chapter 2. Just the fact that he is not, we never see him exercising his authority apart from counsel.
Right.
You know, every decision that he's made has always been at the advice of those that are around him. So there's a great level of respect
Yep.
for the opinions of those that he has in his court.
Yeah, so he's not a one-man show as far as that is concerned. I mean, he did like that. Now, I find it interesting in verse 16, Tim, that it goes and says, which is in the month of Tebeth, the 7th year of his reign. So we have 5 years that we know about from the time of the war and this choosing of a queen. So that would mean, if you go back to it, that probably Vashti was queen for about 2 years. You know, because this is 7 years of his reign. So he had just gotten in. 2 years into his reign, he has this big feast. Vashti is the queen, and then all that had happened there. So Vashti is queen about 2 years, if my math is right.
Yeah.
Now you got 5 years where there is no queen. And the king loved Esther. Now, I look at that word loved. I think probably a better word would have been the king found favor in Esther. Because I look at love one way, you know, like I love Patty, and, you know, in all that goes with that, I don't see that is the kind of love that this verse is talking about in 17. Do you think it is?
I would agree with you. And again, I think we have to take into consideration the culture and how women were viewed overall. You know, they were not, you know, much like they were even in our country up until, you know, really about 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Women were considered subordinate. And the fact that, as we will see later, and as we actually already saw in chapter 1 with Vashti, that as a queen, even though you were his queen, that did not give you the right just to be able to approach him anytime you wanted.
Right.
There were still processes that one would have to go to, and they had to submit to whether or not he allowed them to come and talk to him. So there's this aspect that's coming into play that we have to remember.
Right. So I think that word love, you know, as I would read it anyway, would be more of finding favor than love as you and I would know love today, you know, of our spouse or of our kids or whatever. So anyway, he found favor above all women. She obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the others, so that night he put the royal crown upon her head. So from that night on, the search is over, right? All the girls that go after Esther, they just go into the concubine pool without even meeting with the king.
Yeah.
But, you know, once again, where was it that Esther placed? Well, she found favor with the chamberlain. She found favor with the guard of the women. She found, so you would think that this means that she was brought up closer to the top than not. That's at least the way I would see that. So that, you know, she does that. So he places the crown on her, verse 17. He makes her queen instead of Vashti. Vashti now is totally out of the picture. Where in verse 1, she was still being thought of.
Yep.
And she was still in the picture. Now, if he had not found anybody of all these virgins, I suspect Vashti would have been made queen again.
Could have been.
But that's why I think verse 17 is ever important, and made her queen instead of, the word instead of means what? Vashti was still in the running.
Right.
As I see it, all right? So that happens. 18, the king made it a great feast unto all the princes and the servants, but they loved the feast. And even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the province and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Now, these gifts were not only for the royal families or the governors and the kings. This is for everybody, even the subordinates, even the peasants got some gifts. And once again, this just shows the great generosity of this king. You know, so he does that. So the virgins were gathered together the second time when Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred. Once again, same as in verse 11, she doesn't tell yet where she's from.
Right.
as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai. Go down to verse 21 to 23. In those days, while Mordecai was now he's sitting in the king's gate.
Mm-hmm.
All right. First of all, he's able to go walk around into where the women were preparing. Now he sits at the gate. That is a seat of prominence.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they sit in the gate, you find that in other Old Testament scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even Lot goes and sits in the gate, right? Because he's found on the outside, and then he moves inside, and then he becomes involved, and then he becomes even a part of the gate, or the gatekeepers or the politicians of the day. Now, he goes and starts telling us there's going to be a plot against the king. Two guys want to assassinate the king.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, maybe it's because he chose Esther over Vashti. Maybe they were supporters of Vashti. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, God is not giving us all the details.
Could have been brothers of the runner-up. Who knows?
Could have been. Whatever the case may be.
Yep.
Anyway, so there's a plot against the king, and the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So you have this man sitting at the gate. Oh, royal king.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Mordecai. He just informed me that there's a plot to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
All right? That's where it ends.
Yep.
Usually they would say, oh, bring him before me. I want to honor him. He does not do that at this point. And we find at the end of verse 23, it's written in the Chronicles before the king.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Later on, we're going to find that he can't sleep one night. So what do they do?
Mm.
Like everybody does, right? You can't sleep, so you have someone come in and start reading you the Chronicles of the king.
Yeah.
Just happens to be the one that Mordecai is mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where chapter 2 ends.
Yeah.
But it's a great drama, and I love it because, I think God allows us to use our imaginations without doing any harm to the scriptures.
Right.
And that's one of the things I want to make sure. We can use our imagination, but just don't do any harm to the scriptures or do anything that's going to hinder the scriptures. And I think it's a great drama.
It really is.
And it helps us in our own lives too.
Mm-hmm.
How God does a process and how God does a preparing of us to find his favor as well as be used of him.
Exactly.
Anyway, I'm Pastor Harold Noyes, pastor of the Community Christian Church located on the Lower Road in Athens, Vermont. And we have morning worship at 9:30 every Sunday. And then we have evening worship 6 p.m. every Sunday night. We have a Tuesday night Bible study, Wednesday night prayer meeting, other things going on. And we'd love to see you if you're in our area. We'd love to have you just say, hey, I'm so-and-so from here, and I heard you on Heartline, and, it'd be nice to talk to you.
Mm-hmm. And if you're in the Charlestown, New Hampshire area, Life on Main meets at the Charlestown Senior Center at 223 Old Springfield Road, right there in Charlestown. We meet at 10 a.m. for coffee and fellowship on Sunday mornings, and then our service is at 11 o'clock. And we would love to have you come join us as well and be a part of that, and just give us a chance to get to know you and a chance for you to get to know us as well. And we want to thank everyone for tuning into the broadcast. We especially want to thank all the staff here at Fact TV for making this program possible. And get the word out there. Let your friends and family know about this program. We're on a lot of the community TV stations along the Connecticut River of southeastern Vermont and southwestern New Hampshire. If you know people that are outside that viewing area, they can also find us on Fact TV's website at fact8.com or on our social media channels, whether that be on Facebook, whether that be through YouTube, on Rumble, or on Truth Social. And if you are more the person that likes to listen to audio podcasts, you can also find us on most popular podcast providers as well.
Good. And we look forward to seeing you next week.